Welcome to my channel and welcome to a new podcast. It is called Unveiling the Battle Plan. Before we begin, a quick note. Don't miss my website, boombustreport.com. And now let's get started with Unveiling the Battle Plan. Anyone following the mainstream press these days will notice that something like a mental mobilization is taking place in Europe. We're hearing about a supposedly imminent Russian attack. The economy is supposed to be transformed into a war economy. From an economic perspective, one thing is clear. The danger of war exists, and it is increasing. But for a different reason than most people probably think. The reason for the increasing risk of war is the state as we know it today. It is aggressive both internally and externally. Military conflicts between states are therefore not a tragic accident, but rather a logical outcome. I want to explain this in more detail, specifically the economic cause of war that has plagued human history, especially in modern times. To do so, I first refer to the book published in 1919 by the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, titled Nation, State and Economy. In it, Mises offers, among other things, an explanation of how the First World War could have happened. Mises argues that it was the abandonment of the idea of free markets, free trade, individual freedom and equality before the law. In short, it was the rejection of liberalism and the rise of the state as we know it today that led to the First World War. Because the state as we know it is aggressive, both internally and externally. It has a built-in incentive to wage war against other states in order to pursue its interests by force if necessary. State and war, so to speak, go hand in hand. To understand this, let's consider a few basic economic insights. It is an irrefutable truth of human action that people have goals which they seek to achieve by using means. They prefer more means to fewer means, and they prefer earlier satisfaction of their needs to a later satisfaction of their needs. As rational beings, acting humans sooner or later recognize that the division of labor is beneficial to them because it increases the productivity of their efforts. The division of labor means that each person performs the activity they can carry out at the comparatively lowest cost. The division of labor makes exchange necessary. After all, when people organize themselves through the division of labor, most no longer produce for their own needs, but almost everyone produces for the needs of others. It is therefore the division of labor that brings people together. Through it, they recognize one another as mutually beneficial in mastering the challenges of life. Simply put, the buyer of a good has an interest in the producer of that good doing well, because otherwise they won't be able to buy the desired products. The division of labor is a natural phenomenon in a system of free markets. Here, consumers are free to demand the goods that best meet their needs. And producers are free to offer their fellow human beings the goods they wish to buy. A system of free markets, if left undisturbed, would gradually lead people all over the globe into a very tightly interconnected division of labor. The result would be lasting, peaceful and productive cooperation among people. In short, peace. Because war is alien to the nature of a free market system, people who understand the productive power of the division of labor have no incentive to engage in something like war. Unfortunately, there is no truly free market system in the world today, nor has there ever been one. For many centuries, especially since the beginning of modern history, there has existed what we call the state. It began in the form of the feudal lord, then the king, later the emperor, and in more recent times as the republic, the dictatorship, or the modern democratic state. What exactly is the state? When thinking about it, many people first think of ideas like the state is us, or father state, or we can't do without the state, who else would build the roads and schools, support the needy and provide law and security? However, the logic of human action leads to a very different answer. From this perspective, the state as we know it today is a monopoly of coercion and violence. The American economist and social philosopher Murray Rothbard defined the state as we know it today as follows. The state is the territorial monopolist of compulsion with the ultimate decision-making power over all conflicts within its territory, and it claims the right to collect taxes. Such a state is, of course, not a natural institution. It is not based on voluntary cooperation. It could not arise in a system of free markets where there is only voluntary cooperation and voluntary exchanges, no coercion or violence. That the state is based on coercion and violence was stated clearly by the German sociologist, physician and economist Franz Oppenheimer, who incidentally was the doctoral supervisor of Ludwig Erhard, the father of the so-called social market economy and the second chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. Oppenheimer wrote, "The state, quote, is in its origin and by its very nature a social institution imposed by a victorious group of men on a defeated group, with the sole purpose of regulating the dominion of the first over the latter and securing it against internal revolts and external attacks. And the dominion had no other purpose than the economic exploitation of the defeated by the victors." Quote ends. The state, as defined by Rothbard and Oppenheimer, is an aggressive institution. It is aggressive internally. Towards those it rules, the state seeks not only to maintain but also to expand its power. Through more prohibitions and regulations, more laws, higher taxes, inflation, and so on. The reason is obvious. If the state holds the territorial monopoly of power to make the final decision in all conflicts on its territory, and if it also has the power to collect taxes, including the inflation tax, then it, or rather the people exercising state power, will naturally make ever greater use of that power. Over time, therefore, the state, as we know it today, becomes ever larger and more powerful, while the freedom of citizens and entrepreneurs is increasingly restricted, controlled, and destroyed. The state does not only grow larger and more powerful internally, it also expands externally whenever a suitable opportunity arises. States that feel ideologically connected have an incentive to form a cartel, to eliminate competition among themselves so they can expand their power unhindered as a group. The prime example of such a state cartel is the European Union. But when states pursue different interests or adhere to different ideologies, they have an incentive to expand their power aggressively, even through war. World history is full of wars between states motivated in exactly this way. When people in large states follow opposing ideologies, the risk of war between them is particularly high. Examples include the military conflicts, the numerous proxy wars fought between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. From an economic point of view, it is clear the state, as we know it today, is aggressive. And so military conflicts between states are not a tragic accident, they are the logical consequence. Large states are particularly aggressive externally because it is relatively easy for them to obtain the resources needed for an aggressive foreign policy: money, weapons, and soldiers. At the latest, when preparing for war, it becomes brutally clear that the individual is completely subordinated to the interests of the state, as we know it today. The state resorts to military conscription and forces men into war service. It should also be noted in this context that war can serve as a tool for special interest groups that use the state for their own purposes. Consider, for example, a situation in which states are hopelessly indebted, and the state rulers conclude that they can only preserve and expand their power through an emergency. In that case, to them war easily becomes a means to an end. Or think of influential special interest groups, for instance, the military-industrial complex, seeing war as an opportunity to enrich themselves, and they therefore push the government to bring about the war. When rulers and not the ruled decide on war and entry into war, when the citizens have lost control over their fate and their political system, the situation becomes especially dangerous. This was true then, and it is true today. The Prussian philosopher of enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, already pointed this out in his 1795 essay Perpetual Peace. He wrote, quote, "If the consent of the citizens is required in order to decide whether there shall be war or not, nothing is more natural than they would be very cautious in commencing such a poor game, since they would have to decide to bear all the calamities of war themselves, such as fighting, paying the costs of war from their own resources, repairing the devastation left behind, and finally, to add to the evil, bearing a heavy burden of debt that would embitter peace itself and could never be paid off because of the constant threat of new wars. On the other hand, in a constitution where the subject is not a citizen, and which is therefore not a republican, it is the easiest thing in the world for the ruler, who is not a fellow citizen but the owner of the state, to decide on war for insignificant reasons, like a kind of pleasure trip, since he loses nothing of his own at his tables, hunts, pleasure palaces, court festivals, and so on, and can leave the justification of war for the sake of decency to the diplomatic cause, which is always ready for this purpose." Quote ends. In short, one could say, uncovering the true nature of the state is essentially unveiling its battle plan. Anyone who truly wants to prevent war effectively must, as Ludwig von Mises already said, try to restrict the state, politics, and politicians as much as possible. They must also support the free market, because it is the guarantor of peace and prosperity for people on this planet, not the state as we know it today. Therefore, anyone who believes that the solution to the war problem in, say, the Ukraine-Russia conflict lies in further arming the states, in sanctions, or in ending cross-border division of labor and trade is making a serious mistake, or pursues an evil agenda. The problem of war will also not be solved simply by defeating the aggressor. It will only be solved when the ideologies that lead to war are completely discredited and no longer find support among people. In this sense, Immanuel Kant wrote, "Peace must be established. It does not come by itself." I would add, peace arises when people voluntarily cooperate with one another in free markets. Peace is not established by the state, quite the opposite. If this topic has interested you and you would like to know more, especially what all of this means for the economy, the financial markets, your money and your savings, then I recommend reading Dr. Polite's Boom and Bust Report. All information is available at boombustreport.com. Thank you very much for your attention.